Kia ora koutou. Today I'm going to talk to you about why backyards matter for birds and other biodiversity, and perhaps tell you about things you can do in your own backyard to improve it. But first of all, really just want to talk about the things that are causing problems for birds in our communities. Birds have got a lot of things to deal with. There's too many rats, there's a lot of traffic noise, we've got a lot of poor diet and disease through feeding birds. There's a lot of lost pets out there. And really importantly, we don't have enough of a shrub layer and really poor vegetation structural diversity for our birds. So we're not really giving them enough habitat in our cities. And really importantly is this spillover between backyards and the natural areas like this bush patch. So the great thing about living beside these bush patches is that the lovely things in here, like the birds, are going to come hopefully into your backyard and spill out of the reserves. But unfortunately, the bad stuff from your backyards, what you do in your backyards, influences what's happening in these reserves or bush patches. So we really need to take care about what we're doing in our own backyard because it does matter. So what do we know about the birds in our bush patches in Auckland? Well, they're actually really quite good. They're dominated by native species, and this is a study done by one of my master's students. So if you go into a bush patch, you're likely to see lots of pewaka, some tohu, silver eyes, tui, riorua, grey warbler. So really the high abundance up this end is the native birds and not so much of the introduced species, which is really good. But what Sam did find was that you're likely to get more native birds if you have fewer houses around them because of the negative implications of having a lot of people around bush patches, but also less noise, so less traffic was really important as well. So what about the birds outside of the bush patch, just in our suburban matrix, we call it, outside of those bush patches? Well, it's not looking great. So outside that in our suburbs, generally dominated by things like sparrows and your feral pigeons and myna. Blackbirds usually get up here in most backyards, and only in some suburbs where the vegetation is pretty good, do you start getting things like your tui and your tohu silver eyes. And again, Sam found that you're likely to get more birds if there's less noise, but really importantly, in this part of our suburbs, if there were more trees and a shrub layer. So that layering here, the structural diversity is really, really important. We're going to talk about that in a bit. So I guess one thing that I have been thinking about is flipping the fleet to EVs as New Zealand gets further down the line of switching their fleet to electric vehicles. Then the quiet noise may actually be beneficial for our birds. So we might be seeing a few more birds in our suburbs because of this. We can plant, of course, well to buffer some of this traffic noises as well. So we have to think about that a little more. But really the problem is tree loss. So this is Waitemata Local Board, and this is up to a third of their urban forest they lost over a 10-year period. So this seems to be replicated throughout the city of single tree events. So that death by 1,000 cuts, where you get multiple single species, single trees lost throughout a suburb, when it all adds up to a large loss of urban forest. And then even when we do have trees, we tend to do this, have large trees, not without any shrub layer at all. Even more horrible is when they're in concrete like this, but no shrub layer at all, very individual trees with just grass underneath. And we know that having complex vegetation is really important. There's a great little YouTube video you can go and have a look at that explains why gardens are like layer cakes and that birds need the different layers. There's some birds that will only visit the canopy, well, there's other birds that will feed lower down and on the ground. So we need this diversity of plant structure in our gardens. And what about rat control? So we know that there's a lot of people out there doing backyard rat control. Well, Rosie, supported by Auckland Council, did some research on this. And she actually found just who was nesting when she looked at that. Native birds were more likely to nest in backyards with predator control and native vegetation. So having native vegetation in your backyard was really important just to even attract those birds in to nest. And fledgling success was higher, so birds were more likely to hatch and get to adulthood and fledge away when you serviced your traps and your bait stations more frequently, rather than just throwing a trap out there and checking it once or twice a month. So more frequent servicing is really important. And again, fledgling success was higher in backyards with native vegetation, which might have something to do with the complexity of vegetation and the refuges that vegetation can have. So if we just look at this figure, you can see here quite obviously the things on the left of the red line. This is where there was pest control. On the right where the big no is, there was no pest control. And the purple is the number of nests that have fledged. So you can see there's a lot more fledging when there's pest control. And I've just highlighted some of our native species here. So for the piwakawaka, this was really important, and for our silver-eyed, the tohu as well. You can just see there. And of course, we have other pests from our backyards as well. And New Zealand has the highest cat ownership in the world. And Sam, one of my master's students here, looked at what cats were sort of coming into urban bush fragments. And she looked at 8 fragments in central Auckland and on the North Shore, and she found 53 individual cats, and you can tell they're individual by their pelt pattern. So about 3 to 9 domestic cats per fragment. And here's just a couple of examples from her project. Here you can see the bush fragments in the middle. Each of the green rectangles here is a camera trap, and each of the orange paws is a different cat. So you can see that for this bush patch here and this one here, there's a lot of pressure coming in from different cats from the neighbourhood into this bush patch, which is having an impact on all sorts of biodiversity in there. And just from my backyard, a very small property, I put some camera traps out and had 18 different cats in 8 months through our property. So it's quite phenomenal how many cats are moving around our suburbs, which is not great news for reptiles and birds and other biodiversity in our backyards. Okay, so what can we do? So the messaging is, if you love your cat, keep it inside. You'll have fewer vet bills because it'll be safe from traffic, be safe from cat fights, and there'll be no fleas, which is a good thing. So New Zealand's starting to follow the lead of other countries, particularly Australia, where there's a lot of devices to either keep your cat happy inside or in your backyard. So lots of different cat runs and things that keep your cat in the backyard by putting devices around the top of fences as well. So the conversation is moving forward on this. So we just need to be thinking about how this is happening and what we can do as individuals as well. But it's not just cats. We're also losing pet birds. And we have a lot of invasive birds that perhaps forget about their impacts. Sometimes we're focused on rats and even cats. But we sell a lot of pet birds in New Zealand through sites like Trade Me, but also pet shops. So there's a large wave of parrots in New Zealand birds. And we do worry about our native parrots because we have some incredible parrots to protect that are vulnerable to competition for nest sites, for food, but are also at risk from these parrot-specific diseases as well. So we do have a lot of concerns about this. So what we did was we looked at lost bird records that owners were listing on things like Trade Me, and found that 331 birds are lost per year on average, and that's 33 species. So 92% of all birds being lost out of people's cages and into cities is parrots. And that's quite concerning given what I've just said about our native parrots and the disease risk. And these top 5 species make up 3/4 of the birds lost, with some species in here that we're very much worried about, the rainbow lorikeet and the Indian ring-necked parrot. And as a result of this and some of the other risk assessment, these species are now banned from sale in Auckland through the Auckland Regional Pest Management Plan. But we are looking to see if we can have some national bans on some of these species and look at some of the other species that can either hybridize with these or have similar behaviour. So that's the next steps there. And I guess one of the other things we should talk about is bird feeding, and is it really helping birds? And we've had a couple of PhD students work on this topic. And what we found is that when you put out bird bread and seed feeders, what you end up with is getting feeders that are dominated by introduced species. So bread and seed is not great. There's also a disease risk. So salmonella was found on these bread and seed feeders. And the important thing is that native birds don't eat bread and seed. We don't have granivores, things that eat grain. We have things that eat insects and flowers and fruit, nectar. So we'll talk about how perhaps if you have to feed, maybe you want to put out sugar water for native birds, how you can reduce that risk in a moment. So what can we do, given all of these things I've just talked about, what can we do as individuals to help? So when you're feeding, if you have to feed, please don't feed bread or seed. It doesn't help the birds in any way. It just helps invasive bird species. If you want to feed native birds through sugar water, if you really need to, then please only do it in winter. We need to let our birds pollinate species of plants and do their jobs. Use commercial feeders that restrict access to that sugar water, so it doesn't encourage things like sparrows, and it doesn't allow feces to accumulate, so not open dishes. And you need to clean, clean, clean. So use hot water and scrub those dishes out very frequently. And as in this picture, make sure that cats, the feed is up high, but also that the cats can't and other predators can't jump off vegetation into that feeder as well. It could just become a real problem in attracting predators to it. But really what we like you to do instead is make your backyard wildlife friendly and bird friendly, providing all the resources that birds need. So they don't need sugar water if you're providing nectar and insects and other things through the plants in your backyard. So have birds got the critical habitat and resources they need in cities and in our backyards? And sometimes we're so focused on killing the pests that we're not really thinking about the vegetation in our gardens. And unfortunately, we get this minimalist garden kind of design sold to us as a winning garden in this case. So there's very little structural diversity here, very little resources for birds or biodiversity. And even worse, in a suburb away from me, to see artificial turf in lieu of lawn, lawn is not great. Artificial turf is far worse. There's no organic structures whatsoever, and the microplastic is going to be going down our stormwater drains. What we do need to do is not embrace this minimalism, to accept messiness and some structure. So we want to be tidy Kiwi when it comes to plastics, but not when it comes to vegetation. So sort of two extremes here, where this is far too tidy a backyard, very few resources or vegetation structure for birds at all, compared to the layering in this garden here on the right. So just learning to accept some messiness is really good. Main thing we need to do is stop chopping down trees in our backyards, because if we're doing it, everyone else is doing it, and it's death by a thousand cuts. And we need to start planting different layers and structures in our gardens. And you can do this even in small gardens with narrow plants like cabbage trees and rewa as well, that take up very little space but still provide those resources for birds and insects. We also need to get away from this idea that it's my land and I can do what I want, and think about community benefits. It's a bit like immunisation. So you can see here in the top left that all of these trees in this backyards individually might not be providing terribly much, but all together are providing this awesome corridor, this vegetated corridor to this bush patch over here, compared to the one down on the bottom right, where we're not got much at all. So just if those people start individually chopping down trees, then we're in trouble and we lose this corridor. And we have this fairly new urban Ngahere strategy in Auckland, and we also have some action plans for each local board. So I encourage you to engage with those and tell your local board what you'd like. The overall vision for it is a preference for native species, but also the right tree in the right place. So we're not putting giant Cody trees right next to houses. So I'm really thinking about how we can give all residents can have access to trees. So worth engaging with this one. And it's really important not to get hooked up on some of the sales pitches around these plants. And this prunus now, the Taiwanese cherry, is banned in Auckland. But in this particular advertisement, it talks about the tui tree, like it's a tree, a native tree almost, that tui have evolved with, when actually it's a major weed of our forest. You can see these shade-tolerant seedlings starting to pop up in our forest fragments. And of course, we have our own native tui tree, the kowhai. So there's no need to be relying on these weeds when we have our own native nectar-bearing plants that grow really well in urban areas. And this little invertebrate down here is to remind me that actually tui really need invertebrates too, particularly need that protein during the breeding season, in particular for feeding their chicks. So it's not okay to just be providing the sugar in nectar all of the time. We need to provide plants, particularly native plants, that have a lot of native invertebrates on them for tui and other birds. And of course, we want our native invertebrates to flourish as well. Also, what you're putting in your garden really matters, because we have a lot of weeds in New Zealand, and most of them have come from gardens. So they're like this conveyor belt that moves from your garden, jumps the fence, and goes out into the wild, into our bush patches. So whatever we're putting in our garden, that can spill over into those forest fragments. And you can see from this diagram here that we've got a lot of introduced plant species in New Zealand, almost 25,000 compared to the about 2,000 native species we have. And every year, about 20 of those introduced species go into the wild and breed in the wild and become naturalized. And we have about 400 going on 500 environmental weeds so far. And most of those, unfortunately, have come from garden escapes. So we've got a real problem with this one. And you know what? We have this, there's bottle brushes, this Australian bottle brushes that we plant everywhere. And although they're not weedy in New Zealand, we actually have a New Zealand bottle brush, the rewa rewa, which provides, not only does it provide nectar for our birds, but it also has co-evolved with invertebrates and fungi and lichen. So we get the extra biodiversity with it. So I talk about this as leveling up, that when we use native plants, we're not only getting the benefit of that native plant, but they've also co-evolved with native invertebrates and fungi and lichen. So we're getting a whole lot of other native biodiversity, and they often have very important cultural significance for Māori as well. But mostly, I think our native plants need better PR. Often people think they're slow growing and don't have beautiful flowers, when in fact, there are some plants, native plants, that are just perfect for gardens and have beautiful flowers. So they just need a little PR. So backyards are really critical. What are the things you can do? Please, if you have a choice, native species where possible. You have all those extra benefits that you get with them. Don't let your pets out. Try and contain your pets in your backyard. Pest control is really important, not just the mammals though, the rats. We also need to control weeds. We need very diverse and complex plantings for birds and invertebrates, so we need food, lots of diverse food and structures. Don't feed the birds bread and seed that does nothing but encourage invasive bird species and can facilitate disease in our birds. One thing we didn't talk about is light pollution, but we know that light pollution can have effects on wildlife. So if you have security lights outside, make sure they're shielded so the light is focused down and not spilling out into the vegetation. And also put those on sensor as well. They don't need to be on all of the time. And don't be a tidy Kiwi, except for plastic, but try and embrace a little bit of mess and untidiness. And really importantly is peer influence. So tell everybody what you're doing, and hopefully that'll encourage others. Thank you very much.